What I would like to do this afternoon is take that everybody would have read the material, and want to begin by with an archival note. The argument about the business of the human within the Black radical intellectual tradition, and I say intellectual, not political, the radical intellectual tradition is not a new argument, and it's also not an argument that Fanon makes in The Wretched of the Earth or that Césaire makes in the discourse on colonialism. It's also not an argument or a question in a philosophical, anthropological kind of way about the human, but rather I would want to suggest is perhaps one of the most significant political questions within Black radical political and intellectual thinking. In making this particular assertion, I want to point to the work of the Institute of Black World in Atlanta in the 1960s, and a set of seminar series, which they then established as a tape collection. And the title of this series is called New Concepts for the New Man. And just listen to who is speaking in this particular six-week seminar series. George Beckford, who is one of the seminal economists that developed the idea of plantation economy. William Brown, St. Clair Drake, who many of you would know is a person who was written about Africa and African diaspora and who was at Stanford. Vincent Harding, C.L.R. James, Robert Hill, and Walter Rodney. Just to give you an idea of the assembly of people, of individuals in the 1970s, in 1971 specifically, who were working on this particular research seminar. What is also important, I think, is the advertisement for the seminar and then the subsequent tapes. It reads, and here I quote, "We at the Institute of the Black World believe in creating a new humanity. Black men and Black women must break the shackles of past thoughts and actions," end of quote. So I want to put this there because this is the question of the human, the questions of what is the human, as I put it, and how we can create new forms of freedom practices is not a new question, and is not just Fanon and Césaire as we read it as we read them in the various classrooms. I think this is an important prelude to my remarks, particularly because we know that Sylvia Wynter, and the interview you have read between she and Bedor Allegra, was formerly associated with the Institute of the Black World and was on the board of directors in 1978. I think it's important to point this out because I don't think that we can begin to understand the current work of Sylvia Wynter without grappling with that strand of influence in her thought, strand of influence that was connected to the work that the IBW was doing. That when we do that, as some people do, that what we do is that we abstract her thought from all sorts of contexts. Having said that, I want to make 4 points about emancipation, freedom, and making of the human. And the 4 points are not descriptive statements, but rather like 4 thesis points. Let me begin with point 1, or the first thesis. Political modernity does not begin with the French Revolution, the American Revolution, or the English Revolution of the 1640s. It begins with the Columbian voyages of the 15th century, the conquest of the indigenous populations of the New World, various forms of genocide and servitude. And it also does not begin with the debates between Las Casas and Despuvula in the 1550s about whether or not the native population in the New World could be subjugated, whether or not they had souls, and whether or not they were people by nature, and therefore could not have souls. Using a Winterian formulation of that debate in the 1550s of thinking about whether or not the indigenous people were human, what I think is clear is that there begins at the point of political modernity that I'm identifying. And when I say begin at the point, I'm being very cautious and here, because I don't believe that things in history begin at a moment. I think you have an emergence, a kind of confluence of things, and something else emerges. But just for analytical kind of precision, I want to talk about, one talks about a certain kind of beginnings. And so the beginnings of, if you think of Christian, of modern political modernity, is really also the beginning of a Christian man. And I want to talk about this business of Christian man, the way Winter talks about it, and borrowing from her formulation, because what it then does, it gives us a different historical narrative about who we are, about what it is that we are, and what I like to say, what is it that we are, and also begin to think about a certain kind of history and trajectory that then talks later on about possibility. So where then does political modernity begin? And again, I want to put that in heavy quotation marks. In my view, not just with the Columbian voyages, as I've said before, but in 1539, that is before the Las Casas debate, with a series of lectures and a series of discussions that are happening in Spain about the American Indians. And the most important discussion is really instigated by a man called Francisco Vitoria. And his lecture that he gives is lecture on the American Indians. And this particular lecture, this is what he says. The question about the, in quotation mark, the barbarians in the New World, commonly called the Indians, he says, is really about, can they be baptized? Now remember the idea of Winter, that to be a human or to be a Christian man was, to be a man was to be Christian. So that therefore, can they be baptized meant could therefore be Christian. And then using Aristotle, he basically argues that these barbarians, and here I'm quoting him, are governed partly as slaves, and war might be waged justly on them. End of quote. It's a very long lecture, and I'm just picking up for you, they highlighting some of the key phrases in that lecture. Therefore, he would conclude they have no rights, and that the Spanish colonial power needs to observe. What is critical here, I would want to argue, is that what is being put in place in this particular debate in the middle of Spanish colonialism in the New World is really who has rights and who doesn't have rights. And that this idea of who has rights and who doesn't have rights is done on the basis of who is human and who is not human. And therefore, the question of being human is deeply tied to, at the beginning of political modernity, at the beginning of the business of secular colonialism, is tied to this idea of questions of rights and who therefore can do this and who therefore can do that. What I would want to therefore suggest to you is that this particular debate consolidates a certain classificatory schema in European intellectual history, in which people like Buffon become very important. And that in this classification of human history, what happens, I would want to suggest to you, is the creation of what I call the regimes of man. What I'm trying to do is to tell a different story, not the story of now, okay, political modernity and the nation state and so on. I'm trying to say a different story that tells us about, that begins with genocide and servitude of the indigenous people, certain classificatory schemas, and that different regimes are formed. And these are not just regimes of knowledge, as Foucault would talk about, but we are really regimes of man, and that therefore regimes about who is human and who is not human. So that's my first thesis. My second thesis is that this particular notion of human, and therefore particular notions of rights that accompany human, gets expanded within the French Revolution. However, it does so within the context of the racial plantation slavery, forms of colonialism, particularly secular colonialism. Therefore, in the context of the questions of rights, what happens is that rights have to become associated with politics. And I think this is really very important, because what you begin to get, and when you look in all of the history of political thought, Western political thought, is that you see questions of rights really emerge in relationship to representative government. It relates they arise at the moment of, okay, now monarchs do not have the divine right. So who know, what are we? We all have, or white people, white men in particular, have free will. So what kind of rights it is that we have? And therefore the questions of rights, in my view, all congeal around questions now, not of equality or of being human, but also congeal around questions of political equality. And therefore the notions of political equality become very narrow. And I think all of this is important, because what I'm trying to do is to lay a ground for a different kind of history. Because we say that the American Revolution, for example, expands political equality. And then some of us would criticize it as for property owning people, white men, and so on and so forth. But my argument would be that's true, but it could only be true because there is a logic that's been opened up in secular colonialism and plantation slavery, which means that the horizons in which people are thinking about questions of rights are structured and shaped by those kind of things, those kind of practices that secular colonialism and plantation slavery are engaged in. And therefore, the rights becomes extremely narrow. It's not a question of exclusion. It's a question of how narrow it becomes and what people understand by rights. This is also very important, I think, thinking about the American case, or the America, about America where I live, and where a lot of us live at the moment, because the idea of America as exceptionalism, one idea is that somehow rights is always expanded and equality is expanded. My argument is that rights and equality are not expanded and cannot be expanded, because the very horizons and very basis and grounds on which it was formed does not allow for that. It may allow for some people to join. It may allow for Barack Obama to join it. But to join it, you have to have a certain mark of being what it means to be human. You have to go to Columbia, you have to go to Harvard, you have to go to law school, all of those kind of things. In other words, if you are assimilated with the system, then you might be able to enjoy the things. But if you are marked outside of the system, in the way a lot of Black bodies and indigenous people are marked, then in fact you cannot be inside the system, and rights, you do not enjoy rights. My third point, though, is this, that it is the Haitian Revolution that not only breaches this system, that the Haitian Revolution is not only the unthinkable revolution, in the words of Michel Rolfe Trujillo, but is what I have called in another article, the Legba Revolution. And when I say Legba Revolution, I'm drawing here from two things. I'm drawing from voodoo practices, which are central to the revolution, but I'm also drawing from Haitian Creole and a certain kind of symbolic order that comes out of this. And the Legba is the actual spirit that works, that is at the opening. The Legba is a spirit that speaks all languages, or can speak all human languages. The Legba is a person who stands between the different laws and humor. So he, and it's usually a he is actually, he's actually at a crossroads, and he's actually an opening. And therefore, for me, what I would want to argue is that the dual Haitian revolution is this is a Legba revolution, drawn from Haitian voodoo and from Haitian Creole. And that also is, if you listen carefully to what I'm saying, what I'm also trying to do is to describe a revolution not in the normal way in which we think about revolution, but I'm actually using the archive of voodoo and of Haitian Creole to begin to think about the revolution in those terms. rather than to think about the revolution as national liberation, slave revolution, whatever, but to actually think through how it is, what it is within the actual language and the symbolic order of people, of ordinary people in Haiti, that how therefore can we begin to think about this? And this didn't come to me just by me sitting down in my study in Providence. It actually came to me working in Haiti for some months with people and also listen carefully to voodoo songs. And then beginning to realize, okay, how that kind of that symbolic order and the orality of it allows one to begin to think in a different kind of way than how that we have conventionally trained as academics and intellectuals. I think also, though, but that there are other things about that Haitian Revolution that makes it important. One is that one wants to think about the questions raised in the revolution, the ways in which, for example, women in the North fought for equality, the ways in which they said to the male revolutionaries that you have to support us. We fought with you, which also tells you they fought with them. So it's not just the men who fought in the indigenous army. And the ways in which the actual French colonial folks at the time tried to split that. I mean, there's a letter I've read where the French was talking to two revolutionary men leaders, and they said to them, please don't agree with equality with the women, because if you do, all of us as men are in trouble. All of us. Not just you, but all of us who are men. So that for me becomes an important way in which, therefore, it also means we have to, when you read a statement like that, you then have to begin to think, okay, what were the women doing for them to reach independently? That's that position. There was no black feminism. There was no feminist movement. There was nothing around like that around. But for women in a revolution to reach that position, to make that demand, so that the French colonial authorities are worried and plead with the men, please don't do this, because you would jeopardize us, tells us something. But the second letter of this particular person who I read, he wrote a letter back to his wife and family. He said something which is really important, which I will never forget, and which led me to begin to think, how does one again think through archives differently? He says, these blacks have a philosophy of freedom. Those are his words, a philosophy of freedom which we don't know about. And therefore, that struck me that if this is a man who has come to Haiti, to what was then still Saint Domingue, and that he beginning to find that this is a place that he don't quite understand, even though he's a Jacobin himself from Paris. I also just want to say, therefore, one other thing is that then the Haitian Revolution, because one of the things that emerges as well is that when one begins to think about these blacks have a conception of freedom, is what were those practices? And then when you begin to look at for some of those practices, you suddenly find that black ex-slaves were demanding ownership, not of plots, which we all talk about. And there's a reason why that ends up that way. But they were talking about how to manage the plantations. They will elect the people who will be managers. And then more importantly, there are conversations which I've read of reports where blacks were saying to each other, we will determine what to do with the surplus, who will sell it to. Now, to me, this is 1801, 1801. All the fundamental or critical questions that are raised in capitalism about workers and so on are being answered in what was a slave revolution, so-called slave revolution. But this is a revolution that, if you think about it as a Legba one, then you begin to understand how questions are raised. And it therefore seems to me that what you are looking at coming out of that experience is not emancipation, but questions of freedom. So that my point here, therefore, is that political modernity, as the way we understand it, emerges at a certain moment rooted in secular colonialism and colonial racial slavery. But that the revolutions, and either the French or the American Revolution and the British English Revolution, are themselves limited by the structures of this particular rule. But that the black slaves themselves have a different conception of freedom. that conception is instigated by revolution, or as or when you read W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction and that remarkable chapter Coming of the Lord, in which he drops all historical apparatus and he essentially attempts to think about what the slaves themselves, ex-slaves themselves were thinking. And therefore, the ways in which one wants to think about some of these things is how the revolution opens up these possibilities of radical imagination that, that say, quote unquote, normal times does not happen. Right. My fourth thesis and fourth and final thesis, that is around questions of freedom and emancipation. Emancipation, in my view, and we can go through this, has a long genealogy. And it is a genealogy which is about release from dependency. And it is part, if you look both at emancipation processes in the Caribbean and United States, you will see that it is never freedom, it's not about freedom, it is always about a certain release from dependency. It's always about what the white abolitionists and the people, you know, the good white people, if you want to put that in quotation marks, was always about, okay, how to make these people free from some form of dependency. Because the question of slavery, or one central question of slavery, was about dependency. Freedom, on the other hand, both for the ex-enslaved as well as for the colonized, was about something different. And it is not just a set of practices which Du Bois does, or the set of things, set of practices which Du Bois writes about, or a set of practices which some of us are trying to work through when we study Haiti. There are two quotations in my mind that always keeps me on track when I'm thinking about freedom. One is, and they're both novelists. One is from the Caribbean novel, both Caribbean novelists. One is Anglophone Caribbean, and it is from George Lamin, and the novel is Seasons of Adventure. And there are two characters that the novel begins with. One is Powell, the other one is Krim. And Powell, is a very complex character, which we can talk about if you want. But what Powell says to Krim in a discussion about freedom is that, Krim, if I give you freedom, I will control your life forever. That always strikes me, because therefore it is a question that if I say to you, I give you freedom, then okay, I'm going to control your life forever. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to talk about the trajectory in which you can do this. The second novel is from Patrick Chamoiseau from Martinique, and it's a remarkable novel called Texaco. And there's a female character in there called Sophie Marie, who also says, freedom cannot be given. Freedom cannot be given. If you give it to me, you can take it away from me. And therefore, it would seem to me that therefore this question of freedom is about a certain kind of self-activity, a certain kind of practices of people, that is not something that can be given from on high by any nice person in the dominant ruling class, or any middle class, or any person that feels that, okay, woe is me and these people are marginalized, let me help them, and so on and so forth. That freedom is about taking control of a certain life and transforming that life and the society in which you live in. And I want to make that distinction very clear from the kind of freedom that somebody like Marx talks about particularly in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, in which he describes very clearly, as only Marx can at that point in time, this question about human emancipation, and how human emancipation is not, I think in the article I said the Jewish question, but it is really the economic and philosophical manuscripts, that this question of human emancipation is linked to the worker, is linked to the questions of alienation, is linked to questions of commodification, certain kind of political economy of value, and the questions of, and obviously the question of surplus. And that tells us a particular story of capitalism that then ends up in human emancipation. The question I ask, however, is what happens when in fact there's another story? There's a story that begins with indigenous people and genocide and servitude, and then also maps itself along with racial slavery. And therefore, that what you then begin to get is a situation in which you get a different notion of commodification. That is not double commodification, as I've called it sometimes, or triple commodification. But when you think about questions of gender, as the person female who's a female slave is reproducing by force, by sexual violence, reproducing another commodity in her child. That rather what explains this is César's thingification, which I made reference to in the essay. And that thingification, therefore, begins now not from the position of commodification, but thingification begins from the process that a human being is a res, in the Latin, is a thing. And it is that business of the human being a thing, and the ways in which violence, therefore, has to reproduce that thing and to create death worlds that creates what I've been calling for Nicholas Gillian, the living corpse. It is that, to me, that then gives us a different understanding of the history of capitalism, and therefore leads us with a certain logic to begin to think about not emancipation, but about questions of freedom. So that all of that, so the question I'm making saying is that secular colonialism and racial slavery opens up a different logic for us to begin to think about questions of freedom, and that it's a different political space. Winter, in her work, in trying to think through some of these questions, not all of them, really thinks about, therefore, the human as practice. And I agree, not as an abstract figure. And in doing that, I would want to suggest that what is also really ditches Western humanism, although people doesn't think she does that. But to me, what it opens up, the space that is opened up when we begin to make both the intellectual foundational shift, and then as we make that shift to begin to think about a different archive, and then begin to think about how to use the radical image, or to think about the moments of radical imagination in which questions are put on the table that are not put elsewhere. And then how do we as intellectuals begin to take those questions and try to understand them and map them as to create a different kind of history, because one needs that history, quite frankly, then different history to think about what the possibilities of a different kind of society is today. In doing that, what I say is that the question therefore becomes, for me in my work, not who we are, which is a question of identity and questions of recognition in my view, but actually what we are. What practices do we create? And how can we transform the social world through a set of practices? And in thinking through that is to understand that the question of the self, and here I'm just drawing from Fanon, the question of the self is never the self in isolation. It is always the self in relationship to. It is what Fanon calls in Black Skin, White Mask, the world of the you. And so that what I'm trying to do is to think through this business of a different genealogy of the human, a different regime of the making of man, using, obviously, drawing a lot from Sylvia, but actually, quite frankly, drawing a lot from the Black radical tradition, and trying to think through what are the questions that this particular radical intellectual tradition, not just in politics, but in history, in art, etc. I mean, Anna talks about art. I mean, I go to art and became interested as one way to answer a question that I didn't understand in the Haitian Revolution, which all the archives, whether it was the French National Bibliothèque or so on, was not giving me the answer for. So that is really to think through this work, not as a kind of philosophical anthropological question, but a deeply political question in which we can try to think about what is it that we are? What can we do about the condition that we are now in as human, as a species? Because it is linked, we are all linked. I mean, questions of ecology and so on. and how we can live in what I say in the essay, in common association. And that at the heart of this idea of common association, which again did not just spring to my head because I was at Stanford, where I was on sabbatical doing this, but really sprang because I was just thinking and talking and working through old documents. And Robin will probably understand this, as well as simultaneously talking to the people who are involved in struggle. That the idea, therefore, of trying to live in common association, but that common association that is actually constructed around forms of radical equality. Not just radical equality in terms of politics, but radical equality in terms of economics. And so to me, those are some of the questions that our tradition has, that Black radical tradition has raised. And those are some of the questions that in my work I'm trying to answer. Thanks very much.